Hello, I am Atia Bharadwaj from Section 15. As a person from a country that was once a British colony, India, I've had the opportunity to observe the true impact of discriminatory practices on the native people of the country. Recently, I discovered that students in the UK are not taught about the colonial practices of their ancestors. Unlike the UK, the US has a history of being transparent about their racially discriminatory practices. I believe that transparency is better than not acknowledging actions as it helps foster trust among people. In this video, I will be analyzing the systemic exploitation of Asian labor and criminalization of racially disadvantaged people, which converges with white privileges seen in Week 7 and Week 9 readings. Analysis of such circumstances is really important to understand the present dynamics of the countries and also acts as a springboard for further development in social aspects like recognizing implicit racist comments, etc. The Week 7 readings focus on the exploitation of Asian labor using race-based nationalism for economic gains in larger territory. Race-based nationalism is a phenomenon in which one race claims superiority and preserves one's identity by oppressing others based on phenotypic differences. The first reading assigned for Week 7 was Chapter 3 from Dr. Sasaki's book, which explores how the U.S. employed race-based nationalism to annex Hawaii and enjoy the bountiful rewards. Hawaii had a sparse white population. The rich Haula oligarchy sought to increase the white population by bringing Portuguese labor to mobilize support for the annexation. Initially, the Portuguese were deemed uncivilized and made to occupy the lowest rank in society. But due to the racialization of the Portuguese as white, their identity slowly shifted to the thrifty and law-abiding people. This racialization changed the racial dynamics of Hawaii. The Japanese, the Chinese, and other groups were now at the bottom of the barrel. The rank in the racial hierarchy was associated with economic growth or regression. Dr. Sasaki points out the large difference in the wages between the Japanese and the Portuguese. The Portuguese were paid almost $45 more than Japanese labor. The stagnancy in the salaries of Japanese labor had detrimental consequences on their perceived identity. This stagnancy not only reinforced their economic status, but the negative notions that became associated with Asian people because of their drastically low wages. A similar situation was noted in California as well. This economic model reinforced the racial hierarchy with the Asians at the bottom, leading to the commodification of Asian labor and eventual alienation due to the presence of white supremacist ideas. A similar notion of Asian labor was brewing in California, led to the dependent businesses. The dependent businesses in California had to produce goods while reducing the input capital and maximizing the profits to compete worldwide, hence, required cheap labor. This requirement of cheap labor was fulfilled by promoting immigration of cheap Asian labor, especially from China. There were three reasons for turning away from free white labor. Firstly, it was extremely expensive. Secondly, the black population was experiencing newfound rights, making them impossible to exploit, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo set limitations to avoid exploitations of the Mexicans as well. Asian labor was a popular choice because they were perceived to be more controllable than European immigrants, that is, more susceptible to exploitation, unlike the black and Mexican labor, which had rights similar to the white population. Thirdly, the US was a strong imperial power in Asia, which treated all Asian countries as its subjects, and could impose different kinds of laws that catered to the economic growth of the US. The author points out various limitations imposed on the Asian countries, like denial of naturalization, introduction of targeted bills like anti-Chinese bills that inhibited the basic rights of Chinese immigrants. The exploitation of Chinese labor contributed immensely to their cheapness. The interaction of exploitability and the cheapness of their services and the limitations imposed on Asian labor resulted in their racialization, reinforcing the stereotypes of their inferior position in society. Both readings illustrate the racial comparison, that is, one race is being considered superior to the rest. Moreover, both readings demonstrate the economic benefits the U.S. based in by racializing inferior races in Hawaii and California. It's imperative to study such a situation, because it acts like a paradigm for its persistence in the present. Today, the race-based nationalism utilized by the Western imperial power still persists in the form of stereotypes and xenophobia, at times manifesting into hate crimes. For example, only recently did I learn that MSG used in Asian cooking is not truly harmful. It was deemed harmful because of its association with Chinese cooking. This negative opinion was propagated due to the racially biased view of the Chinese as not part of the society due to the historical subjugation of the race. The Week 9 readings focus on the convergence of white privilege and entitlement with the U.S. justice system, often combined with the criminalization and exploitation of racially disadvantaged groups. The first reading assigned for Week 9 was a chapter from Social Death by Lisa Marie Chaco. In this chapter, Chaco delved into the San Diegan case of a group of high school students who targeted an encampment near their residential area, perpetuating a near-death attack, robbing and assaulting multiple elderly encampment residents. This was far from a random attack. It was a racialized rampage. The encampment was home to the undocumented elderly Mexican workers who would set up makeshift homes. Multiple factors contributed to the heinous actions of the students. Firstly, the act was racially motivated because the students made intentional use of racial epithets and targeted the encampment because the Mexicans were different and spoke Spanish, which deemed them and their residents illegal and un-American. The second reason is a status-biased motivation. Chaco defines status bias as a phenomenon that associates a person of color with criminal activity because of their phenotypic features and because of their perception by the U.S. law and dominant population. The phenomenon of status bias combined with their racial motive is reflected in the students' preconceived notion about the Mexican elderly being undocumented immigrants, which would deem them criminals who were unprotected by the law, making them easier to ambush. The racially driven and status biased crime is closely linked with white supremacy, the phenomenon of reinforcing racial hierarchy by dehumanizing other races to retain the power of the dominant race, that is, the white population. Because the students dressed up as INS agents, alluding to the idea that Caucasians have the supreme power over other races by dressing up as the law themselves and terrorizing those who are vulnerable in front of the law. Further instances of white supremacy are reflected in the indifferent attitude of the high school students towards the victims, because the group believed there would be no repercussions for attacking the illegals who do not have rights under the law, as Chaco says. The above case is a clear example of a de facto crime, which is a status crime where a person does not need to do anything to commit a status crime because the person's status is the offense in and of itself. Correctly said by Chaco. The notion of a de facto crime draws from the deep-rooted tradition of white supremacy. Moreover, the San Diegan case of hate crime uncovers a deep systemic issue of unfair influence of white privilege on the criminal justice system of the U.S. We can see the partiality posed in the lighter sentence of the white high school perpetrators, which forced 4 out of 5 to serve for a year, despite the implementation of Proposition 21, ordering the juveniles to be tried as adults for maximum possible penalties for serious offenses. A stark difference is observed in the sentences of non-white convicts with white convicts. For example, in cases of immigrants' deportation of children, the children and the parents are penalized for unlawful entrance. Such court decisions highlight the disparity in the sentences of serious crimes like violence if the perpetrators are white. We see similar conditions and consequences in the second reading assigned for Week 9. In the second assigned reading, the criminalization and condemnation of Black people is evident in the skewed laws implemented by the criminal justice system and mirror the discriminatory practices of law and justice in the San Diegan case of racialized violence. Right off the bat, Childs talks about the auction of Black slaves convicted due to petty crimes. This line alludes to the systemic discrimination towards Black people, evident even though slavery was abolished. The law continued to exploit the Black population due to the ingrained systemic racism. This time, the revival of slavery was not primarily profit-driven. It was an amalgamation of laws that provided loopholes for the continuation of slavery and systemic racism. One of the main contributors for the continuation was Amendment 13, which was supposed to abolish slavery but failed to do so by allowing rechattelization as punishment for petty crimes. We can see the devastating consequences of the amendment in a situation where a boy convict was pleading to be hired to pay his debt. It is extremely saddening to see a child being commodified just like in the past, showing no change since the abolition of slavery. The amendment can also be considered a colorblind law, which entails no reference to race but is inherently racist in their consequences. Although colorblind laws were for all criminals, it seemed to be used as a weapon by the white population to continue the racialization of the black people. Such laws discriminating against the black population would lead to a persistence of cheap labor because legally the slaves were free and there were no discriminatory aspects to the laws. Furthermore, laws like Amendment 13 and the Civil Rights Act of 1866 enabled the criminalization of target population, that is, the black people. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was passed to protect black rights to essentially being enslaved and work. It was a paradoxical law where the labor could be arrested because they wanted to terminate their contract. This was a clear criminalization of black labor because they were denied the simple right to freedom and could face catastrophic consequences for wanting to break free. The Civil Rights Act also did not protect the free black people from laws that could arrest them on the basis of being idle. Clear example of racial criminalization. Learning about the systemic racial partiality converging with white privilege in the justice system of the US is highly important because it acts like a springboard for correct law implementation in future. The discriminatory practices, though rarely present in laws today, still have devastating repercussions like strong stereotypes of black people being criminals, or in the San Diegan case, the Mexican immigrants not being worthy of law, which can perpetuate hate crimes like the latter case. An example exhibiting strong negative perception about a certain race would be the Breonna Taylor case. This case was supposed to be a drug investigation involving one of the previous residents, but ended up in the death of Breonna because the cops did not conduct a preliminary investigation correctly. Sorry. Here we can see the negative stereotype of Breonna, a black woman, being a criminal and hence was shot to death. This can be connected to the criminalization of the black race that manifested so deeply that the word criminal was simply associated with a black person. In conclusion, I would like to say that systemic racialization and exploitation of Asian and black communities has been legally abolished but has manifested in forms of racism with varying degrees of intensity. By examining historical significance of racism, we can gain a deeper knowledge of how to advance into an equitable society. The above analysis have impacted my concept of manifestation of historical racial discrimination, but the labor and race-based nationalism has had an immense impact on my knowledge. I was able to connect how different stereotypes against Asians were rooted in the perception of them being in the lowest rank, propagated by the skewed American want for economic gains. As a budding clinical psychologist with a deep interest in the geriatric field, my newfound knowledge will definitely be helpful in promoting cultural sensitivity and being able to help seniors who went through difficult situations created by the American government and people. Thank you.